vibe will be there. No, I don't think so at all. Not at all.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Onward panel on energy security. My name's Adam Hawksbee. I'm Deputy Director here at Onward, and I'm joined by an illustrious panel to talk about a topic which, to be honest, a couple of years ago was probably relegated to discussions among kind of energy policy wonks, no offence to those of you who are one of those in the room.
Most of the audience.
But was brought into, we're all wonks here, come on, it's an Onward event. But was brought into really sharp relief by the war in Ukraine and our reliance on states who, you know, to say the very least, do not necessarily share our values, was highlighted as a problem that we needed to address alongside our broader push, which has been, in common parlance, much longer towards net zero. So this discussion is really to dive into energy security, to understand what securing Britain's energy system looks like, how close are we to that goal, what are the things we need to do to close the remaining gap. And we're joined by a fantastic panel to discuss this, from Andrew Bowie, a Minister in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and a long-time champion of the environment and energy within the Conservative Party. Steph Spyro, the Environment Editor at the Daily Express. Josh Buckland, a partner at Flint Global, and prior to that, a policy advisor on this topic within government to a range of ministers. Selene Saxby, who is the Member of Parliament for, and I haven't got it on my briefing, so I'm going to get this wrong, North Devon. I was going to say Devon North. Should have just gone for it. Member of Parliament for North Devon, who again has been a leading light within the Conservative Environment Network and has been a huge advocate for the UK increasing its energy security for both economic and security reasons. And finally, we're delighted today to be working with ESO. Kayte O'Neill, the Director of Transformation at ESO, will be sharing some thoughts about why they believe that this is such an important policy issue to be addressed. Now, Minister Bowie needs to dash off, so what we're going to do is have some opening remarks and a provocation from Andrew. He's going to drop some bombs and he's then going to run. And what we're going to do is they're going to dissect those, and we'll report back to Andrew on the insights that come from the discussion. So, Andrew, over to you.
I'm also the nuclear minister, so we veer away from language about dropping bombs. Please, don't mind. Thank you. Thank you very much, Onward, for hosting this. I was saying to, because other think tanks are available, not obviously as influential or impactful as Onward, but I was saying to the Policy Exchange earlier on today, that this conference, this Conservative Party conference, feels, you know, in many respects, almost like an energy conference. If you walk into the main hall, the exhibition stands, there are a number of energy companies, organisations, suppliers, individuals that are there talking about their investment in the UK, about the transformative new technologies that are being brought to bear in the United Kingdom right now. This genuine energy revolution that we are living through and indeed leading the world here in the UK. It's been incredibly exciting. Also, as an energy minister, incredibly tiring. But it's been great because the positivity around the energy industry it is incredible. I think I have got the best job in government right now as Minister for Nuclear and Networks, because I see from the centre the huge transformative change that is underway, the incredible technological breakthroughs that are being made on a daily basis, these technologies that will benefit people's lives, not just environmentally, but also economically, because if we deliver greener energy, we'll also deliver cheaper energy, and of course, just as important as all that, we will become more energy secure and independent and less reliant on hostile foreign actors, like, for example, our friend Vladimir Putin, for our energy supply and our energy baseload. So it's all happening in the world of energy, but there's one big, not cloud, I'm saying it's not a cloud, there's one big challenge facing us, and it's one that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have spoken about. Indeed, if you look beyond the headlines of the move of the ban on new petrol and diesel cars to 2035 and the discussion on the phase out of oil and gas boilers, if you look at the substance of what the Prime Minister actually said 2 weeks ago, it was on how we transform, radically improve, increase investment in and up the pace of delivery on transforming the grid infrastructure in this country. How we decarbonise the grid, how we build the capacity in the grid to deal with the huge increase in electrification and demand on that grid that we're going to see over the next 4 or 5 years as we bring all of these new projects to bear. Everything else is incumbent on that. The rollout of electric vehicle charging points is incumbent on grid capacity. Inward investment from across the world in new battery plants is incumbent on getting grid capacity and connection times. Everything is incumbent on ensuring that we resolve the big issue of how do we improve the grid and at what speed we do that. So, big challenge for us, but I take great confidence because, and I believe we can do it. And it's not just because I'm a Scottish Conservative and therefore an eternal optimist, but it is also because I get to spend every day of my working life meeting with, engaging, championing, challenging, provoking debate amongst, and getting advice from the most incredible, inspirational, and inventive individuals you could ever hope to meet. Because this country is not short of talent when it comes to people working in our energy sector. We have the ambition, the brains, the drive, the determination, and indeed are now investing the time and money and effort in resolving the big challenges that face us. That's why we're going to continue to lead the world, as we have done by decarbonising faster than any other G7 nation, delivering the first, second, third, and fourth largest offshore wind farms in the world, making huge breakthroughs in fusion, getting 24 gigawatts of nuclear power on the grid by 2050, investing in new technologies, and I could do all the greatest hits. We don't have time for that, but we will reach our net zero target. We're not going to do it, however, if we don't resolve the problem of grid capacity and connection times, and that is why this is such a top priority for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and of course that means that it is a top priority for the Department of Energy Security and net zero. So I don't think I've dropped any bombs, but I do hope that you have a lively discussion and debate. I mean, I look around the room, I think I've met quite a few people in this room before to discuss the issues that are about to be discussed on the panel just now. The ESO and National Grid are doing, and Ofgem, and indeed all the transmission operators, are doing incredible work right now on the issues that I've just sort of set out. They are rising to the challenge. I think in the next few months, we're going to see a transformation in terms of how we deliver the grid of the future and how we deliver better connection times for companies, organisations and individuals across this country. I've got great confidence in them that they're going to be able to deliver it. I was very proud to be the Energy Bill Minister that brought through the regulatory framework that will allow us to build the future systems operator, allow us to move towards a place where we have a spatial plan, and if we actually joined up thinking on this for the first time ever. So yeah, I'm really confident, really engaged, really enthused, and I'm sure, and I'm very sorry to have to leave you, I'm sure that this is going to be a very interesting debate. So thank you very much, Onward, for organising it and for inviting me to open the discussion.
No problem at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
I'm also going to steal a cup.
Oh, do, absolutely. Take two. They make a great gift. So let's start the discussion then. Let's dive into the kind of quite optimistic, ambitious vision that Andrew set out. Quite a lot to do there. I mean, Steph, let's come to you first. What are the potential bumps along the path that we've just heard from Andrew?
So I get the huge privilege and responsibility of helping to shape the public's perception of these issues. And generally, there is a huge amount of support for the green industrial revolution. And people acknowledge that there is a need for energy infrastructure. And it's hugely important that we take people along with us. So otherwise that risks delays, which is a huge barrier, and that slows down progress, which no one wants. If anyone's read The Express recently, we do quite a bit on pylons. I often have the pleasure of speaking to anti-pylon campaigners in East Anglia, particularly where the Norwich and Tilbury line is in the works. So for those of you who don't know, there's a 112-mile stretch of 50-meter tall pylons in the countryside. And the pylon or anti-pylon campaigners have a lot to say about that. They say that energy infrastructure, it's not green if it's delivered destructively. It can often devalue homes in some areas by up to 40%. Consultations have been described as piecemeal and unplanned, so it's vital that communities are part of this process. So how do we overcome the bumps in the road? That's hugely important, and bring people with us. We need consumers to play their role in this. So firstly, it's proper engagement with communities, they don't want tick box exercises. They don't want to feel like they haven't been considered and not part of the approach. So that's hugely, hugely important. And it's not realistic for every single development to have support from everyone, but local consent is important. And then looking at overcoming another barrier is compensation versus benefits. And people don't want playgrounds or the refurbishment of a village hall. They want a lump sum often, especially if their homes are being devalued by pylons, for instance, and they want to benefit from the energy infrastructure in their backyard. If they're seeing it, they want direct support. So in terms of how we get more people on board, I think the media can certainly play a part in that, the language we use, and just making sure that we raise awareness that there's huge opportunity in infrastructure, and just making sure people see the opportunities for jobs, and it's not something to be afraid of. But also being honest about upfront costs and delays and issues there. And then also, I think it's really important that companies' national grid doesn't ride roughshod over people. I think that's hugely, hugely important as well. And then there's something to be said in just certainty and people having direction, knowing what's coming, and being part of that process.
Fantastic, thank you. So one of the obstacles, public opinion, that kind of particularly electrification is going to require quite a lot of infrastructure. How are we going to get that built? Josh, let me come to you next. What are some other bumps, obstacles, challenges to be overcome on the road towards energy security?
Thanks, Adam. It's good to be here. I think it's great to see the PM being very honest a couple of weeks ago about the scale of the net zero challenge and kind of put some numbers around it. And thanks to Steph for giving me some of these beforehand. But kind of electricity demand will increase by 50% by 2035 on the basis if we decarbonise the grid. That means ultimately we need to build as much network infrastructure, 5 times as much network infrastructure over the next 7 years as we've done in the last 30. That just shows you the scale of the challenge ahead of us. And even at a distribution level, the kind of local networks, we've got to upgrade probably at least 30 to 50% of those to electrify, transport and heat. So the scale of the investment needed in the grid system is so significant that as part of the PM's shift to try and focus a little bit more on the nature of the debate, the fact that things are going to have to be built in a lot of different regions of the UK over the course of the next 15 years is brilliant, but ultimately doesn't make that task any easier. I think critically, just a couple of thoughts on kind of how we try and navigate that challenge. For me, and I know Onward's doing a lot of work on future conservatism and kind of thinking about what that means generally, there is a real risk given this challenge that we look to centralise more bureaucracy, more central planning, and to Steph's point, ride roughshod over local communities and local consenting. So whilst the FSO is obviously a very important development for the country, it has to be matched up with local community consent and engagement. It has to be championed with regional system planning and obviously local energy planning as well. It can't simply be a centralised process. That's what the Labour Party have said that they will do. And actually, organisations like Onward can contribute, I think, to the discussion that needs to happen around governance in the energy system and ensuring that local communities' voices are heard. Secondly, and this kind of picks up on what Steph said, communities want to know that they're going to get a fair deal for the infrastructure that needs to be built. Ireland's got a good model where they pay every household that lives within 200 metres of electricity transmission line a set payment. Why wouldn't we do something similar here? That ensures that there is clarity up front for households to know what they're going to have to experience and ultimately the direct compensation to an extent that they will get from that process. Obviously, all of us as consumers will then pay that cost because it will be passed through, but it does create stability and hopefully some level of certainty. And then finally, I think there is a really important process around market reform because the scale of infrastructure investment that needs to be delivered means we can't simply continue with the energy markets we've got today, and that has to be done with a consumer-orientated mindset. So there's a lot of debate around whether we move to something like locational pricing energy in a different way depending on where you live. That is a huge political question and one that a lot of consumers will struggle with. So as we start to think about some of these big structural issues in the energy system, putting the consumer at the heart of that and thinking about how we support people who are not able to either engage or alternatively will suffer the consequences of potentially quite significant shifts over time are thought about up front and avoid a situation where the delivery of infrastructure gets delayed as a result of not thinking about that early on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Josh. So, okay, we've got public confidence running roughshod over public opinion might be a challenge. We've got some issues with delivery, certainly in terms of if we try and deliver this from an overly centralised system, we're going to struggle. Soleil, let me come to you next. When you think about the goal that Andrew set out at the beginning of reaching a position of a higher degree of energy security, what are some of the challenges along the way that you think we need to be focusing on?
I'd agree with the community engagement and bringing the community with you. And I think we actually need a fundamental reform of our planning system so that we can actually do things like put more solar on rooftops. And how I describe transition is very much like a river delta, that we've got lots and lots of little ways that it might happen, but we're not quite there yet, and that we need to, I think whilst it's important to have a long-term strategy, and I really hope we get to a point where somebody actually does calculate the carbon, the cost, what these things really mean. I spoke on a panel this morning about woody biomass. You know, in my mind, Drax isn't a part of the long-term solution to net zero because it is more polluting, but BECCS might be. But at the moment, that is our base load, so we need to have a strategy for base load. You know, I know better than anyone, the sun doesn't always shine in North Devon. But, you know, we need a base load until our nuclear's ready so that we've got that base load. We also then need to be looking at, you know, floating offshore wind. We all know what happened with AR5. Fix, we're now going back to bringing it on land, but all these different technologies, and how do we store it? If we put 250 floating wind turbines in the Celtic Sea, what happens when it is windy? I mean, that's a lot of energy coming in. And some of the associated technologies of hydrogen. So for me, there's lots and lots. It's very interesting listening to colleagues who sometimes get very upset about one technology. For me, there's a lot of them, and at the moment, we might not have all the winners and losers, but we need to constantly learn, and I think there is a risk of strategizing, saying this is the direction of travel, but then suddenly listening to the history of why we set up burning wood today, which made a lot of sense in days of yore, but our understanding of that technology as it has evolved and the science behind it and carbon and what it actually means and what a different size tree leaf holds versus a brand new tree, we know more than we did, and we need to take that learning experience, which I think is a very different approach to government. I think the Prime Minister was right to flag the costs of this, but I don't think that means we are dropping down. It is about how do we get there and bring the population with us, because where I am in North Devon, people are really excited about floating offshore wind. I mean, I've got a massive substation planning just gone in. I've been expecting to be inundated with complaints from the community. It's next to a housing development that actually went to court because we had so many complaints, and not one. So people's view on some of the infrastructure, when they recognise the benefit to their community and the country, has to date, touch wood. So I think it's a very complicated area, but I think any of us that back just one winner this early on, there's a real risk of getting on the wrong horse.
I love the idea that everyone's excited about floating offshore wind. Like, we're all energy wonks now. It's great.
No, really. My students, they built turbines out of those little windmills that you put on the beach and plastic bottles, tied them together. University of Plymouth made a nice big wavy thing, and they had to then anchor it, and then they blew wind at them to see if the anchors worked and how much wind they generated. So, we are genuinely quite excited about it.
Good. I hope the Onward team are making notes. This is how we need to launch our reports. This is great. Kate, let's come to you. So, you know, you're obviously thinking about this an enormous amount as you set up the future system operator and thinking about how that needs to work. You've heard some of the comments you've heard from Andrew. How are you thinking about this challenge, and how does it play out in your everyday role?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me here. It's interesting. A little bit closer. Yeah. I think the thing for me is the ESO is on a journey from where we are today to where we need to be as the future system operator. So, if everyone in the room isn't familiar, the ESO today, the electricity system operator, ultimately responsible for balancing supply and demand in real time. Our job is to keep the lights on, and we have an important and I think a real growing role in some of that sort of strategic coordinated planning that a number of the panellists have described. For me, the establishment of the FSO is about sort of taking that much more coordinated, holistic approach to how we think about these challenges, and almost, frankly, putting it on steroids and saying, like, what do we need to do to be able to bring all of this together? We're still a little way from getting to the FSO. We're hopeful that come summer 24, so middle of next year, we'll have the FSO stood up. And there's a number of really important facets to making sure that it can be successful in doing some of the things that we've talked about today. So First and foremost, it needs to be independent. So one of the things we're doing is taking the electricity system operator out of National Grid. But in standing it up as a public organisation under government ownership, how do you ensure that it is sufficiently operationally independent, that it's away from the vested interests of sort of industry, great, but also, frankly, away from the politics of government, and can actually take this sort of much more holistic, long-term view across the challenges that everyone's described, to say, you know, when you think about the mix of the resources we need on the system, what is the right generation mix, the markets that we'll need to ensure that everything shows up when we need it, and then the networks to make sure that we can move the energy around the country. Like, getting to that overall coordinated view, that is the critical additional benefit that the FSO can bring. But that independence is hugely important to its ability to be successful. So we spend a lot of time focusing on that.
And do you need more from, I guess, two separate questions. So what role do you think the private sector needs to play, a range of different organisations, in helping you to be successful in your mission? And what more might you need from government in terms of complementary policies to help you fulfil your role?
So even the nature of the question goes to the heart of how you set the FSO up for success, right? Because failure for us is you put the FSO in a dark room and ask it to come up with the answers by itself. You're never going to get to the right answer. The private sector is already doing, you know, a huge amount of what it needs to do to think about innovative technologies. What is the changing mix of resources? People are really driving to deliver faster. They want to engage in the debate about markets that are fit for purpose and that enable us to come in and sort of bring that investment to the UK and drive forward. And we need more of that, and we need industry to keep telling us, you know, what works, what will it take for them to sort of come to the party in GB, stay and play in our energy markets. The reality is, though, if I think about that strategic planning that I described, there are some really, really key inputs from government, some key policy positions that will help us almost start to put the big sort of somewhat immovable parts on the map. So, you know, we need to make some decisions about government policy decisions on what will be located where, and with that, you know, we can start on this coordinated planning.
Yeah, no, when I worked for Greg Clark, who's one of our old Secretary of State, many Secretary of States ago now, he called them stakes in the ground, which is ultimately politicians have a responsibility to say, take, for example, nuclear. Are we going to have a set of nuclear power stations? If so, where are they going to be built? And then the rest of the energy system could evolve around that as a consideration, because those sorts of decisions are too big for any individual organisation to make, and are system-orientated decisions and ultimately political ones.
There we go. Okay, let's open this up. Let's take some questions from the floor. So I'll take a few at a time. If you could just start with your name and the organisation that you're from. We've got some roving mics that will be coming around. So we've got one here kind of at the front centre, and then one just behind. If there's one more, I'll take them in a group of three. One just at the front here. There we go.
Richard O'Connell, President of South Devon Conservatives. I wanted to ask a question about Hinkley Point and its supply and when it comes online. Because I did ask a question. I mean, it's a French-Chinese development, as I understand it. But I did ask a question about, because it was being put back and saying, well, we don't have to pay for the electricity until it's actually generated. And somebody said to me on one of these things, oh, no, we're already paying for it. When we signed the lease, we started to pay for the electricity offtake. So I was a bit curious about that, and I never got a straight answer to it. So perhaps I was misinformed. I'd like to get that clarified if I could.
Okay, I think I'm going to be coming to Josh first on that one. Question just behind.
Thank you. Sophie Metcalf from Institute of Government. It's a really interesting conversation, and I think it's great that we're seeing movement on the grid, and particularly the Prime Minister's commitments on spatial planning. We're seeing conversations about planning processes more broadly, and my specialism is offshore wind. We're seeing with the Tim Picks report some really good recommendations on that front. The one area that I sort of remain more worried about is the kind of global supply chain issues, and obviously we saw that recently with AR5 in combination with inflation in cost of capital, etc. But yeah, I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on kind of the the join up of energy strategy so that we get this progress on grid planning, but also supply chains.
That's great. Thank you, Sophie. And then there was one just in the front row here.
Andrew, I'm just a local member. You've mentioned several times, and some of your colleagues in previous sessions have mentioned the challenge of NIMBYism about pylons. Have you investigated higher voltage, larger cables that you can then place on the ground or bury them, and what's the challenges with them? And additionally, as it's about energy security, much of the renewable investment is being backed up by natural gas power stations, which means that both heating our homes directly and heating it through electricity are both coupled to natural gas prices. How do we decouple that?
Excellent. Okay, so decoupling from natural gas, bury cables, and does that goes around pylons, global supply chains, and Hinkley Point. This is the sort of policy wonkery that I was after. This is great. Okay, Josh, I am going to start with you on that question about Hinkley Point. Take it away.
Is anyone EDF in the room? I don't want to get it wrong. That's okay. So my understanding, when I was in government, we had the joy of when Hinkley was kind of paused by Theresa May and then restarted again. It was all a bit complicated. But my understanding of the financing deal is that ultimately EDF and their other investors take the full risk up until the point that it starts generating. And if it increases in cost, which my understanding is it has, based on some of the press reports I've read, they obviously bear that risk as well, and they will then get their contract at that point, but ultimately consumers are protected. Where things are different is Sizewell C, which is the new project that's being developed with co-investment from the UK government, and the model there effectively would mean that consumers start paying during the construction period, which obviously, to the extent that we are all consumers, means that we are exposed to cost overruns and delays, and that's a much more interesting political question as to whether that's the sensible decision. The justification is that it lowers the cost of finance of the projects. That should overall lower the cost, but obviously it's a slightly more controversial system in and of itself.
Excellent. No objections from a kind of EDF spy in the room. No one's jumped up, so that's fine. Sophie, IFG asked about global supply chains. Sulaim, let me come to you on that question. The kind of join up between different strategies. How can we make sure we're resilient? You talked about the range of different technologies. Is government thinking about them holistically?
I certainly think the contract for difference scheme up until AR5 had worked relatively well. Obviously, what hit us in AR5 was a horrific combination of bad inflation, bad strike price, and a lack of willingness, I think, for the department to have a conversation. I had many conversations that didn't go well. But as somebody who's championed floating offshore wind, but I think with floating and fixed, when you look at the differences, it's really important to recognise floating as a new technology. It doesn't have a supply chain even to squeeze. And so the pressures on that supply chain and that have now been caused, and when you talk to the Cornish project, which obviously was successful in AR4, they're saying that what was a 7-year lead time to get their turbines out, we believe it's now 13 years. So a 1-year delay has potentially added 6 years onto the delivery of those projects. And so I'm very optimistic that the new Secretary of State is enthusiastic about floating offshore wind and that we will be able to actually drive these projects, that there is a commitment to move them forward. But the supply chain issue hasn't gone away. The whole world is in the same race, and we don't have enough people making a lot of these parts, which is why at the same time as actually getting these projects over the line in AR5, certainly in the Celtic Sea, where it's a completely new supply chain. One of the work I do with the all-party parliamentary group I set up here is to try and get the Welsh and the North Devon, North Cornish businesses and ports working and thinking together and recognising there's no point us all doing the same thing. We might as well have this bit be an expert here, you build some of those, you do the ball bearings, so that we actually do have our supply chain in place, but that we're not competing internally because it is a global race. But things like turbines, the lead times, my understanding on those is long, and that the projects that potentially had them reserved for AR5 have had to lose those slots in the queue. So I think what happened is problematic, but I'm very much hoping as we move into AR6 that we will be able to actually rectify what did go wrong.
Steph, I do not want to pigeonhole you as the kind of pylon czar on the panel, but this question about pylon NIMBYs, are there options with high voltage cables, burying them, to what extent have they been explored?
The last thing the anti-pipeline campaigners in East Anglia want is the crisscrossing of cables, and they advocate for it to go underground, and they want an integrated offshore grid is what they're calling for. So they claim it's £2 billion cheaper. National Grid says the opposite, is more expensive. So it all comes down, it's a matter of cost. I think from the sounds of it, it doesn't sound like there's much entertaining of the idea to underground the cabling at this stage. It is something that other countries do. They have offshore energy islands. I think Denmark does. But I think at this stage for the UK, it's just down to cost, and it's the country sticking with pylons above ground.
Josh, is it £2 billion cheaper to bury cables?
Well, not to answer your question, but my understanding is one of the reasons HS2's costs have gone up so much is because of all the undergrounding in the Chilterns of the tunnels. So maybe that's a good kind of proxy, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd understood that burying cables was massively expensive. / I think we wrote that in a report. So hoping it's true. Kayte, let's come to you on this final question about decoupling from natural gas prices as much as possible. But by all means, feel free to jump into any of the other questions if you'd like.
Yeah, I think there's sort of been two angles, haven't there, to this reliance on gas debate over the last couple of years. One from a sort of a security of supply perspective, and as we saw the illegal invasion of Ukraine, really crystallising what does that mean for us from an energy security perspective. And then sort of very closely sitting alongside of that, then the market implications of being driven by gas prices in wholesale markets. I think what you've seen over the last couple of years is a real strong focus on sort of looking at that gas question through both of those lenses and making sure we've got a series of plans in place to start to address that. So one of the things that government have done over the last couple of years is spent a lot of time thinking about sort of reform of electricity markets in their entirety, and how do you ensure that you can get to a set of markets that value resources appropriately in the places where we need them at the time at which we need them, and encourage all of the right activity in the market. From a security of supply perspective, it's been about thinking about how do you minimise that reliance on gas, and a huge part of that is, actually how do you get renewables to the fore, and then how do you integrate those sort of two questions. So, I'm confident that there's a lot going on. I do think it's critically important that we come to a conclusion on REMA, the review of markets, sooner rather than later. But it's a very controversial debate, as you know. So.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, let's open it up to a few more questions. Blimey, okay. We've got, let's go, so hand back there, one just in front, and then actually I'll take these two at the front and we'll do them as a four. Yeah.
Hi, Andy from the Centre for Net Zero. I want to ask about flexibility. So we talked about the massive infrastructure challenge. I think general agreement that flexibility is going to be a good thing. The more we can get in a system with intermittent renewables, the better. Save money for everyone, save households money as well. So a general question on how do we scale that, I guess. And then a more specific question, Josh, you mentioned locational marginal pricing, big political challenges. I don't know if anyone wanted to pin their colours to the mast on that one and say which side you fall on the debate.
Okay, I will ask Steph that one. Okay, next question just in front, just there, sir. Yeah, it was just you said the hand.
Sorry, thank you.
No worries.
Mike Drury from UK Atomics. Josh, you mentioned that the energy that's required was, I think you said 50% more. As we decarbonise, there's an awful lot of things that we're going to have to look at. Transport, residential heating, commercial heating, and then, of course, power to the grid. So I totally agree with that. But the question that I've got for you is, are we looking at all the right technologies? Is there more technologies that still have to come? And with that challenge of introducing new technologies, what do you think are the three most important things to consider? And I'd like the view from the panel on what those three things might be.
There we go. Not two, not four, three things. Let's get a question from the front here. Yes, you, sir.
Peter Fleet, Cheshire and Amersham. EV infrastructure charging, right? For all the fuss last week, the change to the zero emissions mandate was actually tiny, right? The huge issue is the fact we've only got 45,000 fast chargers, which is woeful. So what is the big policy, regulatory or investment change that's kind of required now, not 5 years' time, now, to massively accelerate that infrastructure rollout?
Excellent. And then the other question just here at the front.
Hi, I'm Fatima. I'm here as a party member, but I work for an energy developer, and we develop wind farms across Wales. The problem that I'm having is that when it comes to the wind farms during our consultations, people are fine with them. They think they're quite cool. It's the pylons that people have an issue with, and unfortunately, it's the Conservative councillors that are really against the pylons. It's understandable. They want the votes, but they're spearheading big public meetings, spreading a lot of EMF propaganda, unfortunately, and it's becoming very problematic. And just on the undergrounding, it costs about 7 times more than overhead lines. So, yeah, it's really expensive.
There
and
we
it
go.
causes
That
a
was the
lot of
stat.
ground disturbance.
Cracking. Okay. Steph, I am not going to come to you on pylons this time. I want to come to you on that first question from Andy at the Centre for Net Zero.
Sure. So that was on. Sorry, what was the question there?
On kind of flexibility of supply. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think ultimately, so customers are going to be vital to reducing demand at peak times. So they have a huge role to play there, and that's the media has a part to play in public awareness, ensuring that when there is peak demand on the grid, that consumers know what they can do to change their ways. Definitely. I think good market design is important now to improve how future generations, how to ensure that they're less impacted by the costs of fossil fuels, definitely. And that's possibly where locational marginal pricing comes in. So people benefiting in areas, again, as I said earlier, where the infrastructure is for sure. And the media has a role to play in all of this, and just communicating things to the public and ensuring that the language we use isn't complex, and they get these messages, so they come along with us.
Cracking. Thank you.
Worth saying that we saw some of this in the most recent winter. So ESO developed a flexibility product called Demand Flexibility Service. It was the first time really that we'd sort of gone out to householders with that sort of national campaign to say, you can help make a difference at a time of crisis. You can help make a difference. And by the way, there's something in it for you as well in the form of reduced bills. And it was a relatively small-scale programme last winter, but we actually did start to see some of that behaviour change, and we're going to run that programme again this year and really try and sort of reinforce that message with consumers that these opportunities exist for you to play your part, and that there's something good in that for you. And the pleasing thing for me, I think, this year is that we've seen industry really want to engage and participate and make that service available to their customers. You do need the media and the good stories and the people sort of willing to talk about the value of this type of service. But you also need industry to get behind it and figure out ways to provide access to those services to consumers. So feeling good about that going into this winter.
Selene, let me come to you to a couple of these questions. One on EV infrastructure and the other on pylons, both basically about how we can get over barriers to delivery of some of the infrastructure that will make new technologies effective. How do you think about both of those problems?
EV chargers, as a rural MP, I drive a hybrid. I'd never ever get to Westminster or back again if I didn't. So I think it is an incredibly challenging thing to deliver for any council. And I do also, there is part of me that wonders if longer term hydrogen may be part of the solution of our vehicles. That I know that's not the conversation we're having now, but some of these problems as we go through in an area like mine, if we do suddenly have excess energy coming ashore, which is going into a hydrogen plant, which we're going to use to decarbonise the port, is there then some hydrogen that could power fleets of vehicles, which might be significantly easier in that region than trying to get us to an electric charging point, actually, when your constituency is the size of mine. So I think it is a real challenge, but it is something that's happening. And as we see consumers change, those people that are buying electric vehicles are buying them and having their own plug. So they will then demand that change. And I think it is that transition that's perhaps going a little slower, which, again, in support of the Prime Minister's view, we need to actually sort of bring people with us, and most people will have moved if they get a new car to electric by the time we're at 2030, but give people a bit longer to get over the line, because I agree, it's a problem. And pylons, they're definitely going to be a problem. I can feel it coming at me. And I believe there is a 10-minute rule bill that actually, or the private members bill that came top of the ballot, I believe, was about pylons. And I think we do need to, again, reflect. For many of us, our constituents, mine is a hospitality destination. I don't think people are perhaps ready, and I think that's one of the shocks that comes with the system, that when you do talk about plugging in floating offshore wind, people's vision is it's like a little plug and you just plug it in and off we go. And the good people of Alverdiscott, which is in my neighbouring constituency, I think were quite shocked when they saw the scale of what the plug-in for the Moroccan solar farm coming into Alverdiscott looked like. Goodness only knows what the floating offshore wind one's going to look like. And I think we need to be a little bit more upfront, in the same as the Prime Minister said, about bringing people with us on that journey and understanding what these problems are, because we've talked a lot about cables on land, cables under land, but cables under the sea and blue carbon and some of the other technologies there's a whole load of other factors to take into account about the damage we're doing at the same time as we're doing what we need to do. And I think the only other point I'd make in answer to all the other questions we haven't talked about in here at all today is insulation, and that actually if we're talking about how do we get people to use less, we really need to find a way to insulate our homes. And whilst I fully accept, because of the unintended consequences we've already seen of landlords leaving the sector, because in drafty constituencies with old houses like I live in, is it right that the landlord has to pay that and can't offset it against tax? But how do we find ways, can they offset it against tax? How do we ensure that the poorest people in our society who live in drafty rented HMOs are actually, when they do have to switch the lights on or make the tea or coffee, are not hemorrhaging their heat out of their properties? So I think that is a real challenge in there. There's some great government schemes out there, so please do check the government website if you need to put some insulation in. But I think that is an area that is perhaps an easier thing to bring people with us, because people can see the benefit on how we can deliver that change.
On the public opposition point, I mean, Josh talked about, Onward have written about community benefits as being a part of the answer to make sure that people get kind of forms of financial incentive, compensation, whatever you want to call it. Do you think that's part of the answer, or is it a red herring?
I think community energy is a hugely popular idea, and I think, again, it hasn't been made into a tangible proposition. So what does this look like? People mostly do just want money. They don't want the village hall fixing. But I think that the pylon issue, if you haven't had a pylon in your view, is very similar to where we were with wind turbines, where most people actually now accept, I love them, I think they're great big windmills up in the sky. But most people don't see a pylon with quite such enthusiasm.
Sure.
And I think sort of Andrea Leadsom had some very interesting ideas about what more could be done to put pylons down motorways and down train lines, and that actually, can we think about it more strategically in areas that are already industrialised? What could we do to ensure that the power flows along those same infrastructure highways? And I do hope that those strategic thoughts will go on, and that's been the frustration over with East Anglia, where you've had all these cables come up and come in, whereas the hope really is in the Celtic Sea we can get one cable corridor coming ashore.
Kayte, let me come to you to this question on technologies and whether we need to be maturing other technologies, and specifically kind of what are the things we should be thinking about when exploring new technologies. And how do you think about that? And then Josh, I want to come to you on this question too.
Yeah, so I think it's become clear over recent years actually how far ahead you need to be thinking about what are the conditions on the system and what is it going to take to have a secure, reliable energy system, not just on a really windy or a really sunny day, but on a sort of a cold, very still day where the turbines aren't blowing and folks need to keep warm, right? So that whole look ahead at the resource mix today is fit for purpose. I think it is worth saying that. We don't worry about security of supply today, but we're very conscious that as we do roll gas off the system, we absolutely need to be sure that the resource mix, the technology mix that sits behind that is fit for purpose for ensuring that security of supply. For me, that the flexibility element is going to be really important. I think storage is going to have a really important part to play, and we need to understand more about what that looks like. What does storage enable in terms of supporting where you do have intermittent renewables? Obviously, nuclear will provide the base load, but we should take comfort from the fact that we don't worry too much about it from a security perspective today. We do need the eye on it for the future.
Josh, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I know, kind of similar points. Okay, I think kind of for me, there's a big question around how you de-risk the current nuclear reduction in supply we're going to get over the course of the next decade. Ultimately, we've got all of our nuclear plant minus one that's existing coming offline, and obviously an element of delivery risk around the new ones. So there, the question is, how do you replace that with what needs to be low carbon, dispatchable power? Not necessarily nuclear. Nuclear current and future is definitely part of that, but there's a big question around hydrogen power, there's a big question around other forms of dispatchable low carbon power. That is the biggest challenge that government has not talked really in any great detail around, and at the moment there is not a coherent plan to resolving. On flexibility, the numbers are varied, but you're looking at 40 to 50 gigs of overall flexibility that's required in the system in 2035. That is an enormous amount of flexibility, of which most of the time at the moment we just have a small amount of short-term batteries. So for me, it's the long-duration storage. How do you store energy, electricity in particular, over a longer period of time to ensure that in the periods where there are excess or shortages, you're able to deal with that in a sensible way? And that's not necessarily just about delivering the net zero power sector. It's also about ensuring it stays a decent cost, because constraint costs are already 4 billion quid a year and are going to increase quite dramatically over the course of the next 10 years without that storage, and that will become a political issue before we realise it. And the final thing I'd just say is on the kind of overall technology side, thinking quite creatively about how we adjoin the gas and electricity systems. One example of that is what we then do with things like heat networks, where there are huge opportunities in the near term around deployment technologies that are not high cost and actually can be deployed in a way which links to what we're trying to do at the moment around heat decarbonisation and makes some progress now. So again, trying to think quite creatively about how we link the gas and electricity sectors, for me, is one thing that we're doing not very well. The final thing I'd just say on location and marginal pricing, I won't comment on it either way. However, I wear the scars of trying to debate, and I'm sure Andrew would say it if he was still here, deal with what are relatively small differences in transmission charging between Scottish and English consumers. And that is a microcosm of the problem you would then have with LNP. So it's just a thought to bear in mind.
Thank you, Josh. I think we've got time for a few more questions, and 3 hands of Josh. This is so perfect. Okay, 4. I can't. You, sir, you've had a question. So let's very specific one as well, if I remember. So let's go one back there, one in the middle there, and then one at the back there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Matthew Hicks, leader of Suffolk County Council, and I'm just going to very quickly add a different view on the pylons. Every MP in East Anglia, every county council, every district council has come out against it, and National Grid haven't given a price for an offshore. If they give us a price, then we could look at it, but they're fairly unaccountable and faceless in terms of being able to engage with. My question is, East Anglia has 10% of the energy NSIPs in the UK taking place in and around the coast of East Anglia. 30% of the UK's energy is either going through or being generated in East Anglia, when we're only going to use 6% ourselves. So how does the panel think we can get better joined up thinking across government around offshore, onshore, nuclear and solar that are all arriving at the same time, but with very little joined up thinking?
Give me some. Oh, sorry, sir. I'm going to ask you a follow-up. What are some examples of that lack of joined-up thinking? What sort of thing needs to be addressed?
So, for example, we need to do highways works now before Sizewell starts. DfT, Department of Transport, haven't released the funding. It's as part of the MRN schemes. It hasn't come forward. If we're not careful, Sizewell will start with no road schemes in place to allow traffic to get there. You've got offshore and onshore. We've got interconnectors being built. Done by different areas, different departments versus Sizewell. So it's all different teams looking at different things.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you. Just in the middle here.
Thank you. I want to mention the elephant in the room here.
Sorry, name and order.
Sorry, Chris Hewitt from Solar Energy UK. So we talk about the impacts of pylons, the impacts of solar farms, the impacts of onshore wind. Do we think the British public is not open to the real impacts of climate change, and to look at this comparison? We are talking about an energy transition which is essential for the survival of our species. That's not mine. This is David Attenborough. This is all the climate scientists in the world. That's what we were talking about in COP26 in this country a couple of years ago. We seem to, and then we seem to forget that and just narrow down on that's going to spoil my view. Am I just being naive that we can't have that debate with the communities that are affected?
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And then question at the back there.
Is it me?
Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Daphne Vlaster and I work for BASF, which is a chemicals company, very energy intensive sector. But we're also investing in renewables. So we launched just a few days ago the largest unsubsidized offshore wind park off the coast of the Netherlands. So my question is, from a GB perspective and a UK policy framework that has been very successful in the deployment of offshore wind and something that we want to preserve and build on, what are the incentives for large industrial users to invest on a merchant basis on those kind of technologies of the future? Thinking as well, I think the ESO have the future energy of electricity, I think, scenarios where we want to be an exporter of electricity in the future. So all of that, how do we bring it together in a policy framework that makes sense? Thank you.
Excellent question. Selene, let me come to you first on this middle question from Chris about whether we're sort of missing the scale of the challenge here, and do the British public appreciate the kind of, in Chris's work, kind of the existential nature of the threat. What do you think?
I think very much like the Prime Minister, when we talk about bringing people with us, this is part of the same conversation, and that actually, yes, like the example I gave of the substation, that we don't have the complaints in from the community we'd expected, that actually I've said nothing, and I will continue to say nothing and see what my community says about it. But I think some communities will respond differently to others, and I think it will depend a little bit on the environment that we're putting those pylons through. But my personal view on a lot of this is that we need to actually get together and get our proper land use strategy in place, so that we actually take a slightly more strategic approach as to how we are going to divide up the country to do solar, to put pylons in, to plant food and eat, because we also have a food security running issue alongside our energy security issue. And I think that land use strategy is long overdue, and we need to really think about that alongside the planning, so that we can get some of these things off the ground and on top of buildings, so that we can use the land below to do other things. So I think there's a lot of conversations that we haven't quite had with ourselves. I think it's a very astute point, and I agree. A lot of people would say, actually, yeah, we're more worried about the planet than we are about our view. But I think there will be others, as we heard from the lady at the front, who will see the world very differently.
Steph.
On that middle question as well, I think every anti-pylon campaigner I speak to is so supportive of the green transition. They all see the impact of climate change. They are on board. They own electric vehicles. Some have solar panels on their roofs. I think they just feel like their considerations haven't been taken into account. I think they just feel like they've been overlooked. Some have had properties for decades that might be worth hundreds of thousands, which are suddenly going to be devalued by up to 40% in some areas and receive no or little compensation, or there's just uncertainty. And I can see how people would then be slightly less supportive of the infrastructure. But generally, people are so on board. They see the impact of extreme weather. So I think if National Grid, if planning could just approach communities better with a bit more consideration, then I think there's definitely a balance to be struck, and looking at compensation instead of benefits. But people are hugely on board. And if I can quickly, it's just to the first question, it's slightly linked, but I think all departments need to come together. And the thing that actually often gets overlooked in all this infrastructure is often the environmental impact. And people kind of say there's no stock take of how wildlife's going to be impacted, or wildlife corridors and things like that. So departments definitely need to come to the table and just zoom out a bit and have a more holistic approach to these projects.
And in the Minister's absence, because I was on a panel with him yesterday where a similar issue came up, he was very keen to stress that there is a recognition that we need to bring communities with us on these journeys, and that parish councils particularly have been put under a lot of duress, and some of the decisions they're being asked to look at and the plans they're viewing are not things that they've perhaps had experience of before, and that we need to get more support into those planning processes to enable communities to understand better the decisions that are coming at them, which I hope will facilitate some of those conversations without too many more protests.
Kayte, can I come to you on this, the final question from Daphne about industrial users and some of the incentives that they face? Excuse my ignorance about the system, but to what degree do you have to take some of those considerations into account with the much larger industrial users of energy?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to that sort of there's the demand flexibility point. How do you engage the real large industrial users in how do we continue to meet their needs of the system, provide a reliable, secure system, but also find ways to the extent we can that those larger industrial users can either participate in the existing markets or can find ways to help us access sort of new capacity as we think about getting those markets right and fit for purpose going forwards. You know, again, I don't want to dig into the LNP question necessarily, but when we take a step back and think about what we're trying to achieve with market reform, ultimately it's about trying to get the right resources to locate in the right place and do the right thing, exhibit the right behaviour at the right time to enable the system to deliver at overall lowest cost for consumers. It's not beyond the wit of man, like that can be done, and if we can do it and get it right, you will be able to unlock access for folks who today just can't play the markets for various reasons.
Josh, can I come to you on Matthew's question about Suffolk and in particular about joined up thinking? Is that something you saw when you were in government? And if not, what needs to be done to make it happen now?
Yeah, it's kind of. I think it's not a problem that's unique to government, to be honest. Like any large bureaucracy or large organisation, even the private sector has this kind of silo mentality, and it's inevitable when you've got a whole bunch of politicians in particular who want to obviously have their own dominion. So in some ways, you're never going to overcome that completely. A couple of kind of practical thoughts, though. Kind of the strategic planning that Kayte talked about kind of earlier is absolutely vital. No community wants to know they're building multiple different pylon systems connecting very similar technologies at very similar locations without it really being thought about. And so the work that the FSO in the future will be able to drive to ensure that the minimal possible infrastructure is built in the most strategically valuable way will ensure that hopefully the impact will be reduced. And that's absolutely vital, and engaging communities obviously in that journey. The other thing that was popular, at least when I was in government, has been talked about a lot, is ensuring that the regulators join up, because you hear a lot of stories around how you're building a new set of pylons across East Anglia. Why aren't you also doing fibre through them? Effectively, you've got the opportunity of doing a lot of disruption. Why not actually improve the fibre for communities in that area and actually suddenly they get a value out of it, whether it's in East Anglia or Wales or wherever. But currently, the regulators don't talk to each other in a coherent way that allows that to be possible. So thinking about how you actually join up not just the government departments, but the key regulators that are orientating those decisions, the more chance we've actually got of ensuring communities get some value and opportunity as a result of that. And I think ultimately, there has to be an acceptance there will be a lot of infrastructure built. So as Selena said, part of that then is trying to ensure communities get the value creation through community benefit schemes and others as well as part of that, and upfront the clarity that they need rather than having to feel they're fighting for it over time.
This middle question about kind of public opinion, the scale of the challenge in relation to climate change compared to some of the policy solutions that we need in day-to-day inconveniences or financial challenges. But you've worked kind of in a highly politicized environment trying to do some of this policy stuff. How does that public opinion play out? We had a poll that came out at the end of last week that showed both that people want big, bold ambitions around climate change, but also are very skeptical about things which, in the short term, the kind of stick as opposed to carrots might impede on their quality of life. So how did you wrestle with that tension?
It's kind of stated preference versus revealed preference. Kind of when you ask someone whether they believe in climate change, they tend to now say yes. When you ask them whether they really want to do some stuff that is disruptive and difficult, they tend to be a little bit more sanguine about the possibility. So unfortunately, that's a dynamic. I think that's unfortunately going to be the case consistently as this transition gets more difficult. So as the Prime Minister said, being cautious on how we take people with us, trying to ensure they have choice and also engagement through that process is critical. But fundamentally also, politicians have a role in setting that political and public narrative. So the danger with the kind of honesty narrative, if you kind of take it as a positive, is that it then slightly dilutes the ability to have an honest conversation in a way which actually starts engaging people in those changes that need to happen. So whilst being honest, Prime Minister and others still then have to be in a position where ultimately they're saying to the public, but we still have to do this stuff and let's get on and do it together. And that's the bit we haven't quite seen yet. It's good to see it kind of starting to come on networks, but obviously there's a whole bunch of other areas that hasn't yet been seen.
Yeah. A professor of mine used to say that leadership is the art of letting people down at a pace they can tolerate. It feels like there is a little bit of that going on here. We're going to have to wrap up there because we've run out of time. So I've got three big thank yous. One, an enormous thank you to ESO for sponsoring this discussion, for sharing insights on the work you're doing in the FSO. We've really enjoyed partnering with you on a range of events, including this one. A massive thank you to all of you for coming along and for your questions and for your policy wonkery. And a massive thank you to all of our panel, to Steph, to Selene, to Josh and to Kayte. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.